presentation. These next two topics we didn't really plan on public questions or clarifying questions, mostly because they're technical topics and updates, but we'll go through questions from the committee at the end, and then I'll just look out there in case there is something that people really want to ask to clarify that topic, but not planning on leaving a lot of time for questions.
Thank you for your time and attention. I've been afforded the opportunity to introduce the next presentation and the next presenter. And again, my name is Dan Tyers, Forest Service and the Yellowstone Ecosystem Grizzly Bear Habitat Coordinator. And I'll make a few introductory comments to set context, and then I'll surrender the microphone to my colleague Lisa Lanneberger, who is the Habitat Database Coordinator for the Yellowstone Ecosystem. And she has arrived just within moments at great hazard and peril of travel and has made it in time for presentation. So we're grateful for that. You've heard reference throughout the morning to the conservation strategy. It's a foundational part of grizzly bear management in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. It's functional, it's insightful as a document, it's made more remarkable because it was crafted in committee, if you can imagine, and it's also very technical. So with the potential of a new delisting rule, it seems reasonable to return to it, to review it, and that's why we're offering it on the agenda today. So consequently, we invited Lisa, who is intimately familiar with the strategy, to provide a primer. And as she presents the basic tenets of the conservation strategy, keep in mind that it's a dynamic document, that it can be revised. And after years of living with it, employing it, a test drive, if you will, we have identified elements to consider for revision. And again, you've heard mention of that throughout the morning. So I think that Lisa has a particularly good way of summarizing a very technical document. See if I'm prophet.
Thank you, Dan. Good afternoon, everyone. I just realized as I walked into the room and kind of made my way around the room, I see a lot of faces that have given the better part of their lives to grizzly bears. And I just want to take a moment and say thank you. Also, I'd like to say thank you to the general public for taking time out of their day to make a point of informing themselves on the status of the grizzly bear. So, as Dan mentioned, with all the discussion about moving ahead with the delisting, it was thought that this would be a good opportunity to provide a refresher for those who have been around for a while, and maybe a primer for those who are a little bit new to the topic of the Grizzly Bear Conservation Strategy, which is the salient operative document for managing the Yellowstone grizzly bear population if and when it's delisted and removed from federal protection under the Endangered Species Act. So it took 30 years from when the grizzly bear was first listed in 1975 to arrive to the completion of the current version of the conservation strategy, which was formally adopted in 2007. And I think it's fair to say that there is plenty of angst, controversy, and lots of compromise between all of the parties involved. And I think, though, if we take a moment and just step back and look at where we are today, I think it's pretty evident that the conservation strategy has paid off. And I think it's, in spite of all of the intrinsic flaws in the document, and I think everybody here has their own ideas of what they might be, I think overall it has led to some remarkable advancements in the grizzly bear population. And I think it makes for a really interesting case in the realm of conservation management. So with that said, you can think of this presentation as Conservation Strategy 101. So what I'd like to talk about during this presentation, first, aside from what is the conservation strategy, I'd like to put some historical context for you, just to give you some idea of what kind of effort it took to craft a document of this scale. And I'd also like to, I think probably my major objective is to parse out the essential elements of the conservation strategy, especially with respect to what exactly does this strategy demand of us as wildlife and land managers throughout the ecosystem. For example, the habitat standards, especially as they relate to what we refer to as the 1998 baseline, and the population standards, which were established for the management of the long-term viability of the population. And then I'll end with a few conclusion remarks. So the conservation strategy, as I mentioned, identifies all of the management actions for managing a recovered Yellowstone grizzly bear population if and when it's delisted and removed from federal protection under the Endangered Species Act. The area of interest, as almost all of you here know, is the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which transcends parts of 3 states, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, and it's comprised of 5, what used to be 6, but now 5 national forests, 2 national parks, and 2 wildlife refuges. So it's a huge piece of real estate transcending many jurisdictional boundaries. The conservation strategy relies very heavily on interagency cooperation, state and federal, as you can see by the logos here. And the document specifies all of the management actions that those partners sign and commit to. And it also identifies the regulatory mechanisms that must be in place to put those actions, into place. It also identifies the legal authorities and the policies to implement the long-term managing and monitoring of a recovered population. So it's important to note here that the conservation strategy by itself is simply a memorandum of understanding, an MOU between all of the signed signature parties. And what I mean by that is by itself, it really lacks any real legal authority. However, the management of the Yellowstone grizzly bear and its habitat is directed by existing federal and state laws, which when combined with the Grizzly Bear Forest Plan Amendment, which is for the 5 national forests in the ecosystem, and the 2 national park superintendents' compendia, that's what provides the actual regulatory mechanisms to implement the conservation strategy. And what I mean by that is the Grizzly Bear Forest Plan Amendment and the superintendent's compendia actually take some of the standards from the conservation strategy and directly incorporate them into their legal plan. That's what gives it the legal teeth. And collectively, this is what renders the conservation strategy a legally binding document. This looks similar to the slide I just gave, and it threw me for a second, but I forgot I threw this in. At the very core of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is the Grizzly Bear Recovery Zone, which is the yellow line there in the center. And you can think of the Grizzly Bear Recovery Zone as a relatively safe haven for the grizzly bear, since 98% of the recovery zone is federal land under public ownership, 36% is designated wilderness, and the recovery zone harbors approximately 41% of all occupied grizzly bear territory within the ecosystem. This recovery zone is divided into 18 bear management units, which are further subdivided into a total of 40 subunits. And the purpose there is to ensure that grizzly bear habitat and the population is well distributed throughout the recovery zone. And just a note on terminology. When the term grizzly bear recovery zone is used when the grizzly bear is listed, and the exact same area here is also referred to as the primary conservation area, or the PCA, when the bear is delisted. And that switch in terminology is just to emphasize a paradigm shift from managing for a recovering population when the bear is listed to one of conservation when the bear is delisted. So you will most likely see these two terms, the grizzly bear recovery zone and the primary conservation area, or the PCA, interchangeably. So as far as the content of the conservation strategy, you have the habitat standards, which apply only inside the grizzly bear recovery zone, and I'll go over those. The population standards and the sustainable mortality thresholds, which apply ecosystem-wide. And then, of course, you have the monitoring and reporting protocols, which is really there in place to make sure that we are actually satisfying or meeting these criteria, and that we report them annually for full public disclosure. And I'd like to mention that habitat management outside of the recovery zone is not guided so much by the conservation strategy. And outside the recovery zone, habitat falls more heavily, is managed more heavily by the actual forest plans and the state plans. So you can think that the conservation strategy really employs a dual-tiered management scheme where lands inside the recovery zone are managed primarily for the grizzly bear habitat, whereas lands outside the recovery zone are managed with more consideration for human use. And the rationale behind that is that such a flexible management scheme as that promotes social tolerance for the grizzly bear. And I think, as we all know, without that social tolerance, the grizzly bear has no chance. So with just that quick introduction of the conservation strategy, I'd like to now, just as I mentioned, give some historical context to give you an idea of what kind of an effort it took to get us to where we are today. So as you all know, this story began long before the first arrival of the Europeans, when some 50 to 100,000 grizzly bears roamed and occupied most of Alaska, Canada, the western half of the lower 48 states, and south into Mexico. With the settlement of the West in the 1800s, grizzly bears were seen as an impediment to progress, and they were pretty much trapped, poisoned, and shot wherever and whenever they were found. So if we fast forward to the 60s, we as a nation face a population in the lower 48 which has declined to approximately 1 to 3% of their former numbers. And thanks to the Craighead brothers and their pioneering research, they put the imperiled status of the grizzly bear directly on the nation's radar. In 1973, out of concern for the long-term welfare of the grizzly bear, the Secretary of the Department of Interior establishes the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team. They were tasked for monitoring the grizzly bear population as well as conducting research on all facets of grizzly bears, including their behavior, their foraging patterns, their diet, the demographics, and also to establish reliable methods for estimating population size, trend, and distribution. In 1975, based on recommendations from the study team, the grizzly bear in the lower 48 states was put under federal protection and listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. In 1979, to help facilitate the recovery of the grizzly bear, the Fish and Wildlife Service initiates the preparation of a recovery plan. And this document is really just it's not a decision document, excuse me, but it's simply providing guidance. I shouldn't say simply, but it was providing the guidance for those steps that would be needed to manage a recovered bear and to get the bear to a recovered status, as well as establishing those necessary sustainable demographic criteria. So to help facilitate that effort, in 1981, the Fish and Wildlife Service appoints the one and only National Grizzly Bear Recovery Coordinator, Chris Servine, who's, I believe, been in this position for 35 years. And this is sort of a, that was then, this is now type picture. In 1982, the initial recovery plan was first completed. And amongst, aside from just compiling pretty much everything that we knew about grizzly bears at that time, it also identified 6 potential areas for recovery, areas where grizzly bears were known to be present, either at that time or relatively recently. And again, the recovery plan is not a decision document, but it is a guiding document which is recommending the management actions to achieve recovery of the grizzly bear population. So to help Chris along, the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee, the IGBC, is formed. And this committee brought partners, the federal, state, county, tribal, all these partners to the table to help coordinate the efforts of the recovery of the grizzly bears throughout the lower 48, and also to establish some cooperation with Alberta and British Columbia. In 1983, the same year, under the umbrella of the IGBC, is the YES Committee, which is here today, and they were assigned with coordinating the grizzly bear recovery efforts in the Yellowstone ecosystem. So in 1993, this is 10 years after the first recovery plan was produced, a revised 1993 recovery plan was put out, and for the first time it identified the grizzly bear recovery zone, as well as all the bear management units and the subunits. And in addition to many things in the recovery plan, it made 2 very distinct requirements that must be met before recovered status could be achieved. The first was to satisfy or achieve all of the population goals in the recovery plan identified in that document. And the second was to complete a conservation strategy, which would be prepared for the management after upon delisting. And they wanted that to be in place, so when and if the bear was delisted, the conservation strategy would be there. However, there was a slight bump in the road in 1994 when the Fund for Animals, as well as 42 other organizations and individuals, filed and won a lawsuit over the inadequacies of the 1993 recovery plan. And they had 2 major arguments. The first was that the recovery plan at that time failed to establish measurable habitat criteria. The second was they demanded some clarification and refinement to the methods used for estimating population size, as well as for estimating the for establishing the sustainable demographic criteria and the mortality thresholds. So, in direct response to that lawsuit, in 1997, Fish and Wildlife Service hosted a workshop in Bozeman, Montana, and it was open to the public. And their sole, I can't say sole, but one of their big objectives was to establish some measurable habitat criteria. And out of this workshop came a very novel idea, which is what we refer to as the 1998 baseline. And essentially what it says is there will be zero net loss in grizzly bear habitat with respect to the conditions that exist in 1998. Okay, this is 1997, but they're thinking a little bit ahead. And the rationale behind this is, at that time, grizzly bears were doing really well. Their population was increasing and continuing to increase. Management strategies on the ground had changed vastly. The open pit garbage dumps had been closed. Food storages requirements were applied. And there's major restrictions on roads, new roads, and development. And so it was thought, hey, things look pretty good. Let's keep it the way it is. And voila, we have the 1998 baseline. In 2000, the first draft of the conservation strategy was released for public comment. And in that draft, it incorporated the new habitat standards based on the 1998 baseline, and I'll be going over that, and as well as the demographic criteria, which were from the 1993 recovery plan. However, at this point, these demographic criteria, we had not yet addressed the concerns for the estimating population size and establishing mortality thresholds that was in the Animal for Funds lawsuit. So that was still something that needed to be done. But at this point, the draft conservation strategy had the 1993 demographic criteria in it. Let's go back here. So in 2000, at the same time here, this is all concurrent, so as the draft goes out for external review, there's a lot of internal review going on as well, and specifically the 3 governors from Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, at the advice of some of the state members of the IGBC, appointed a citizens roundtable with 15 citizen panels, 5 from each state. And the objective was to ask these citizens to develop some recommendations, some consensus recommendations that the states could use as their comments to the draft conservation strategy. And also the states wanted to provide the residents of those 3 states a more meaningful role in defining the grizzly bear conservation efforts. So there was a lot of discussion going on. They held a number of meetings which were all open to the public, and there were representatives from the 3 state wildlife agencies there. But overall, this was a citizens panel. The decisions and the discussions were led by the citizens, and they came up with a number of recommendations. But the topic, this most significant topic that kept surfacing was, what about management of habitat outside of the recovery zone? And in light of that, they made recommendations that the states support expansion of the grizzly bears outside of the recovery zone into areas which are deemed socially or biologically suitable and socially acceptable, where states thought that was appropriate according to their state plans. They also insisted that grizzly bears be managed as a game species with regulated hunting when and where appropriate. So overall, the governors embraced these recommendations, and it's interesting to note that with their first, when they was supporting expansion of bears outside the recovery zone, it kind of got us thinking, well, bears are going to be outside the recovery zone. We need to broaden those demographic criteria from the 1993 baseline or recovery plan, which only applied inside the recovery zone, and establish demographic criteria for the ecosystem wide. So in 2005, we still have that lingering concern of the lawsuit. What about establishing, the lawsuit demanded some refinement in establishing the mortality thresholds. And out of the IGBST workshop, which was paneled by very well-known grizzly bear scientists and statisticians from the government as well as academia, and they made some recommendations for the refined methods for estimating population size and trend, and for establishing the sustainable mortality thresholds to address all the concerns in the lawsuit. And they came up with a series of revised demographic criteria, and these revisions were amended to the 1993 Recovery Plan, and those criteria were ecosystem-wide. In November 2005, so this is 30 years from when the bear was first listed, we have the proposal to delist the Yellowstone grizzly bear population, and this proposal was published in the Federal Register. In 2006, a very important milestone occurs when the forests complete their final environmental impact statement for their forest plan amendment, and the parks came out with their superintendent's compendia. And I say it's an important milestone because this is what gave some of that regulatory mechanisms and the legal authority to implement the Grizzly Bear Conservation Strategy. And so this document incorporated the habitat standards based on the 1998 baseline, and as well as the demographic criteria. So in March 2007, we're at the home stretch. The final conservation strategy is signed by all partner agencies, and appended to the conservation strategy again are the habitat standards based on the 1998 baseline and the revised demographic criteria, which came from the IGBST workshops. So in March 2007, the final rule for delisting the Yellowstone population is published in the Federal Register, and with that, the Grizzly Bear Conservation Strategy becomes the legally binding document for managing a recovered population. However, the status of grizzly bears is always a contentious issue, and 2 years after the final rule, this rule was challenged and overturned when the Greater Yellowstone Coalition submitted a formal complaint seeking judicial review. And in 2000, so once again, in 2009, the grizzly bear was relisted under the Endangered Species Act. In 2011, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service appealed that ruling, and however, that ruling was ultimately, the Montana District Court ruling was ultimately upheld. But the 2011 Appeals Court came out with a somewhat mixed decision. On the first item, they said that the service failed to give a convincing argument that the decline in white-barred pine did not pose an imminent threat to the long-term survival of grizzly bears. On the other hand, the courts fundamentally agreed with the service that the regulatory mechanisms under the conservation strategy were sufficient for managing a recovered population. So on one hand, that was a vote of confidence for the conservation strategy, but it also pointed out there's still some work to be done, and the IGBST has addressed that with their food synthesis. So this has gotten us to where we are today. So that just gives you some context for the conservation strategy. So now I can jump into some of the content that we alluded to. So the first are the habitat standards. And there are 3 habitat standards formalized in the conservation strategy. And they pertain to the percentage of secure habitat, the number and capacity of developed sites, and livestock grazing allotments, all 3 of which are known to impact grizzly bear mortalities. These standards apply only inside the grizzly bear recovery zone. So all three of these factors are measured against the 1998 baseline, which simply means that they must be maintained at or improved upon conditions that existed in 1998. And again, the 1998 baseline is predicated on evidence that habitat conditions at that time supported and perhaps even contributed to the population growth that we observed of 4 to 7% annually between the mid-1980s and through the 1990s. And I think it also is based on the fact that research at that time overwhelmingly showed that the principal agent in grizzly bear mortality are humans. And in fact, it's been estimated by the study team that approximately 86% of all adult grizzly bears' mortalities are human caused. So the idea was to establish some sideboards to human activity across the landscape, with motorized access being probably the biggest threat to grizzly bear secure habitat. So taking a look at the first standard, which is secure habitat, maintaining secure habitat at or above 1998 levels, you can think of secure habitat as sort of a surrogate measure for the human presence on the landscape. And for grizzly bear purposes, it's based primarily on the proximity to motorized routes. And by definition, secure habitat is any contiguous area greater than or equal to 10 acres in size and more than 500 meters from an open, gated, or open motorized route. So even roads that are closed to the public, gated, but may be opened by administrative staff, detract from secure habitat. So on the left here, we've got the current configuration of motorized routes within the recovery zone. And if you generate a buffer, 500-meter buffer around all of those routes in red here, and you eliminate all the small pockets, 10 acres or smaller, what's left in green is deemed secure grizzly bear habitat. And since 1998, there has been no decrease in secure habitat. In fact, it's actually increased slightly, about 1.4%, which translates to an area of about 330 square kilometers, which is roughly equivalent to the size of Yellowstone Lake. So that's how much secure habitat that we've gained since 1998. So the second standard pertains to developed sites. And developed sites is kind of funny because it includes everything from a trailhead, with the trailhead might have an outhouse and maybe, a little patch of paving, all the way to Yellowstone Lodge, major developments. But the idea is that we are trying to track our presence on the human presence on the landscape. And so the standard requires that we maintain the number of sites and the capacity of human use of those sites to be maintained at or below conditions that were on the ground in 1998. So what it means, like if we decide to build a new site, then another site of equal impact to the landscape and to grizzly bears must be closed within that same subunit. And developments on private lands inside the ecosystem do not, or inside the recovery zone, do not count toward this standard. So finally, we have the third standard, which pertains to livestock grazing. And again, it simply says that we must maintain the number and the acreage of livestock allotments that existed in 1998 or below. And we also must maintain the number of sheep animal months at below 1998 levels. And sheep animal months is the number of sheep times the number of months of grazing permit. And the ultimate goal, or one of the major objectives of this standard, was to slowly phase out sheep allotments throughout the recovery zone. And if you take a look at what has happened over the years, today there's only one active sheep allotment inside the Grizzly Bear Recovery Zone, and that's the Myers Creek on the Caribou-Targhee, which has actually taken a no permit, I believe, since 2008. So that's a decrease from 11 active allotments in sheep allotments in 1998 and 10 vacant sheep allotments. There are no vacant sheep allotments inside the recovery zone today. So in addition to the habitat standards, which are requirements, there's also a monitoring protocol, which demands that we do our best to monitor the 4 high caloric food groups, which are a big source of protein to grizzly bears. And that includes cutthroat trout, the seeds from whitebark pine, the army cutworm moths, and winter-killed ungulates. So these are monitored on an annual basis, as long as budget allows, and reported in the annual IGPST reports. So that covers the essence of the habitat standards. So now we can take a look at the demographic and the population standards. So the population standards were, as you can guess, were to facilitate the monitoring, the measurement, the managing, and the maintaining of a viable Yellowstone grizzly bear population. And these mortality thresholds were established for 4 key demographic classes. The first being independent females, those 2 years of age or older, independent males, and dependent young, those which are 2 years or less than 2 years old. And the other objective, aside from the sustainable mortality limits, is to ensure that females with cubs of the year, which is sometimes referred to as FCOY, that they are well distributed throughout the recovery zone. So there's 5 population standards, and the first 2 apply to females with cubs of the year. And the first population standard requires that the number of females with cubs of the year be maintained at a minimum of 48 throughout the ecosystem. And that translates equivalent to the equivalent of approximately 500 individual grizzly bears. And that the number of FCOY should not fall below 48 for any 2 consecutive years. The second population standard addresses the distribution of FCOY throughout the recovery zone, and it says that 16 out of the 18 bear management units must be occupied by 1 or more female with cubs of the year. And that's based on a 6-year running window. And that no 2 adjacent bear management units can be occupied during the same 6-year period. So the third population standard is for independent females, and it establishes a mortality limit at 9%, which is 9% of all of the independent females within the population. We cannot exceed 9% in the mortality. And that this limit includes all sources of mortality, both natural and human caused, and that they are not to be breached or exceeded in any 2 consecutive years. For independent males, the mortality threshold is established at 15%, and again, this limit includes all sources of mortality and not to be exceeded in any 3 consecutive years. And finally, the 5th population standard is for dependent young, and here the mortality threshold is established at 9%. And this includes all mortalities that are known and probable human-caused mortalities. And they are not to be exceeded for any 3 consecutive years. So it's interesting to note that there are some safeguards built into the conservation strategy, such that if any one of these population standards is breached, that the IGBST will conduct a thorough biology and monitoring review to try to determine what is the cause for the deviation and to make some recommendations on mitigation measures. And in the worst case scenario, if the study team decides that these mortality thresholds can simply not be attained, the YES committee has the legal authority to submit a petition to delist or to relist the grizzly bear, the Yellowstone grizzly bear. So the population thresholds the mortality thresholds that we just went over were established for a population that was known to be growing from anywhere between 4 to 7% annually. And it was based on vital data, fecundity and survival rates primarily, that was compiled from 1983 to 2000. So these mortality thresholds tell us something about the grizzly bear trend, the trend in growth. And specifically, that if these thresholds are met, that there's a very high probability, in fact greater than 95% or higher, that the population will continue to grow. Likewise, if these criteria are met, there's a very low probability, less than 5%, that the population will suffer from a decline. However, in 2011, a demographic review of the existing protocol was triggered when the study team saw that there was a potential leveling off in the growth curve that seemed to happen right about 2001. So, analyzing the vital rate data from a more recent period, 2002 to 2011, they sought to determine if that leveling off was real. And what they found is, yes, the population is leveling off. Instead of growing from the previous growth rate of 4 to 7%, it had slowed down to somewhere between 0 and 2%. Now this change in curve is not totally unexpected. For an island population, you can't assume that the grizzly bear population is continuing to grow indefinitely. So based on these findings, the study team recommends a shift in managing the grizzly bear population from one of growth to one of maintaining stability. And in order to facilitate that shift in management, they recommended a change in the mortality thresholds, and specifically they reduced from 9% to 7.6% the mortality thresholds for independent females and dependent young. So it's a more conservative number that's more appropriate for a population that appears to have reached carrying capacity. And I should mention too, that these thresholds were designed in such a way that if they were satisfied, that there would be a very high probability that the population would remain stable. So the reporting requirements, we, at the end of the year, we gather up all of the information on the population standards as well as grizzly bear conflicts and the habitat standards, and it's rounded up and summarized and submitted to the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team, where it's published on their annual report and put up on the web for public consumption. So anyone can Google IGBST or Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team and you'll find this. So I'd like to just make a few concluding remarks, and actually my first one is a question, and that is, has the conservation strategy been a success? Has it been good for the grizzly bear? And I think every one of us in this room will probably answer this question a little bit differently. But the facts are that occupied range back in the 60s, we saw a very sharp decline in grizzly bears. In fact, their numbers was estimated in 1973 in the National Academy of Science report to be at low 234, and it was thought to still be declining at the time they measured that. And grizzly bears were limited to an area of about 16,000 square kilometers, which you can see is pretty much within the confines of the grizzly bear recovery zone. So if we take a look at today, the occupied range, which is shown here in orange, you can see that the range has increased vastly to 58,000 square kilometers, and that the number of bears at very low conservative estimation is 757, and the higher estimate is closer to 1,000, and probably the truth is somewhere in between, and my guess it might be even closer to 1,000. And so this is just to show you both of those ranges on top, one on top of the other for comparison. So finally, I'd just like to mention that the conservation strategy became a legally binding document in 2007 when the bear was first delisted. And when the bears became relisted, technically the conservation strategy no longer is that the operative document, but land managers throughout the ecosystem have committed to abide by the standards in the conservation strategy regardless of the legal status of the bears, because they believe it's based on the best science available. And one of the objectives that we, Dan Tyers and I and others, would like to see happen is to have the conservation or the habitat standards from the conservation strategy be incorporated directly into each of the forest plans so that they become legally binding regardless of the status of the grizzly bear. So with that, are there any questions?